The church doors groaned open and Harlem went still because Bumpy Johnson walked in uninvited. A stranger's funeral. Wrong family, wrong day. Men tightened their coats, expecting blood, but Bumpy's face stayed calm. The church had old bones dotted. Set on a Harlem corner like it had seen too much to be surprised anymore, brick darkened by winters. Steps worn smooth by 1,000 slow climbs. Inside, the air carried candle smoke and damp wool coats. The organ kept its voice low, like it didn't want to interrupt grief. This funeral was meant to pass quietly. The dead man wasn't famous. Not a neighborhood prince, not a headline. Just a name printed cleanly on a folded program, handed out by hands that shook from exhaustion more than sorrow. People came because that's what you did. You came because the family had asked. You came because the street watched who didn't. Man. Stood along the side walls, hats in their hands, shoulders squared like they were holding something in. Women sat tight in the pews, backs straight, eyes fixed forward. A child tried to whisper and got hushed with a finger pressed gently to his lips. Then the doors groaned, not a bang, not a dramatic entrance. Just the old hinges complaining as they opened wider than they had to. Dot heads turned in a single motion like a flock sensing shadow. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the doorway. No entourage. No show of numbers. Just him. He wore a dark coat, cut well, heavy at the shoulders. His hat sat low, brim shading his eyes. The light behind him framed his shape for a second, and in that moment, the church didn't feel like a church anymore. It felt like a room where rules were about to be rewritten. Someone in the back inhaled, too sharply. A man near the aisle shifted his feet, coat opening just enough to show the suggestion of steel. Another man tightened his jaw and stared hard at the floor, as if looking at Bumpy would invite fate. Because Bumpy was not expected, this wasn't his family. This wasn't his corner. This wasn't his dead. And yet he walked in like he had been invited by the building itself. He closed the door behind him with care, letting it settle instead of slam. That small courtesy made it worse. It said he had all the time in the world. The organ faltered one note, held a fraction too long, then steadied again. The preacher's voice mid-sentence found a new rhythm, softer now, cautious. Bumpy didn't look around the way a man looks around when he's uncertain. He didn't scan faces like he was counting threats. He moved slow, not weak slow. Decision. Slow. His shoes made almost no sound on the aisle runner. Still, every step landed heavy in the minds of the men watching him. A step meant distance closing. Distance closing meant a choice had to be made. At the front, the casket rested like an accusation. Flowers crowded around it, too many for a man most folks barely knew. Lily, white as fresh chalk, arranged so clean it looked expensive. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Bumpy noticed it without showing it. His head angled a fraction, eyes taking the scene in as if he was reading a letter. No one else could see. He reached the first pew and stopped, not at the back like a polite stranger, not in the shadows. He stopped where he could be seen. Where? Nobody could pretend he hadn't come. A woman in black, older, grief pressed deep into her face, turned halfway in her seat to look at him. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, the way a mother looks when a threat enters the house. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The message was plain. Why are you here? Bumpy met her eyes, and for a moment there was no Harlem, no church, no crowd, just two people measuring each other in silence. Then Bumpy gave her the smallest nod. Not a greeting, not an apology. A recognition. I know what this is. He removed his hat. That simple act did more than any speech could. It told the room he was not here to mock their grief. It told them he understood the rules of sacred spaces, even if he didn't ask permission to enter them. The men along the walls did not relax. They couldn't. They watched his hands, watched his shoulders, watched the way his coat hung. They watched the calm on his face, because calm could be a weapon. Bumpy slid into the end of the pew without brushing anyone. He sat, back straight, hands folded loosely in his lap like he was attending a service he'd never missed. The preacher kept talking, voice trembling at the edges. Double quotes. And we lay our brother to rest, he said, words careful, knowing the Lord sees what man does not. A few heads bowed. A few didn't. Bumpy's gaze stayed on the casket, not with tenderness, not with pity, with attention, like a man listening to a secret being told slowly. Behind him, somebody whispered a name, his name, under their breath. It traveled down the pews like a match near dry paper. Not loud enough to draw a glare, just enough to spread. Bumpy Johnson. In a stranger's funeral. Uninvited. The expectation of violence sat in the air like dust you could taste. It wasn't that Bumpy looked angry. It was worse than that. He looked settled. A man 2 rows back leaned toward another, lips barely moving. This ain't right, he murmured. The other man didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Bumpy's profile, because everyone understood something even if they couldn't explain it. Bumpy didn't do accidents. He didn't drift into rooms by mistake. If he was here, it meant the dead man's life had touched Harlem's hidden machinery. And if Bumpy had come to mark that touch, then someone somewhere had reason to fear what might be uncovered. At the side aisle, a young man in a cheap suit took 1 step forward, then stopped. His fist clenched, then loosened. He looked toward the family, toward the preacher, toward the casket, as if asking the dead for instructions. Bumpy didn't look at him. That was the control. That was the authority. He did not react to nervous energy. He did not feed it. He let it burn itself out in front of him. The hymn began. Voices rose, thin and uneven, trying to hold the room together. The words were about mercy, about peace, about going home, but Bumpy's presence turned them into something else, a warning disguised as prayer. Bumpy rose when everyone rose. He sat when everyone sat. He did not break the ceremony. He let the ceremony proceed as if it belonged to him too, and in that discipline, the room felt the true threat. Not a sudden shot, not a brawl in the aisle, but the fact that Bumpy Johnson could walk into a stranger's funeral uninvited, and the entire church would bend around him without him lifting a finger. When the preacher finally said, "Let us pray," the room bowed its head. Bumpy bowed his too, but his eyes stayed open just a sliver, fixed on the flowers, on the casket, on the expensive whiteness surrounding a man who should not have had it. And behind that quiet gaze was a question that did not need to be spoken aloud. Who paid for this? And what did they think they were buying? The funeral ended without incident. No raised voices, no shoving, no final spectacle for the gossip-hungry corners of Harlem to feed on. The casket was carried out slow, shoulders trembling beneath its weight, not just from grief, but from the silent pressure that had settled over the church the moment Bumpy walked in. Outside, winter air cut clean through the crowd. Breath rose in pale clouds as people gathered along the sidewalk, coats pulled tight. Conversations began in murmurs, careful at first, then sharper once distance from the church doors felt like permission. Eyes drifted toward Bumpy, without people realizing they were doing it. He stood near the curb, hat back on, hands resting lightly on the head of his cane, not leaning on it, just holding it like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The street knew that posture. It meant he wasn't leaving yet. A black sedan idled across the road. 2 young men stood near it, not bodyguards in the loud sense, no visible weapons, no aggressive stance, but they watched the block with quiet discipline. They didn't scan, like amateurs. They observed like men who understood that danger rarely announced itself. Harlem traffic rolled slow past the funeral line delivery trucks, taxis, a city bus groaning at the stoplight. But even the street noise felt lowered, like the neighborhood itself was listening, because Bumpy Johnson didn't attend things without purpose. And Harlem was a place built on reading purpose. An older man approached first. Gray suit, shoulders bent from years of carrying responsibility nobody ever thanked him for. He stopped a respectful distance from Bumpy and removed his hat. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said carefully. Bumpy didn't look at him right away. He watched. The pallbearers load the casket into the hearse. Watched the flowers follow. Only then did he answer. "Didn't expect to be here?" The man nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he already feared. "They say you knew him." Bumpy's eyes stayed on the hearse door as it shut with a hollow finality. "I knew of him." A difference. And in Harlem, differences like that mattered more than truth. The older man shifted his weight. "Family surprised too," he said. "They didn't send word to you." "I know." That answer ended the conversation without ending it. The man hesitated, then tipped his hat again and stepped away. Sensing he had reached the edge of where permission stopped, a group of younger men lingered near the church steps. They weren't part of Bumpy's circle. Their suits were cheaper, their posture louder, grief mixed with territorial tension. One of them, a tall one with impatience in his jaw, watched Bumpy too long. Finally, he walked over, not recklessly, but not carefully enough either. "Lost?" he asked. The words were quiet, but the disrespect in them carried weight. Several heads turned instantly. Conversations cut mid-sentence. Even the sedan's engine sounded louder in the sudden hush. Bumpy turned his head slowly, like the question had traveled a long distance before reaching him. "No," he said. That was all. The young man waited for more. When none came, he smirked slightly, mistaking calm for softness. "This ain't your block," he added. Bumpy studied him, not as an enemy, not as an equal. As a measurement. "You're right," Bumpy said. The answer landed wrong in the young man's ears. "Not agreement." Bumpy tapped his cane lightly against the pavement, once not a threat. A few men nearby lowered their eyes instantly. Not submission recognition. The young man held his ground for a second longer, pride fighting survival instinct. Then someone behind him touched his elbow lightly. "Let it go," the whisper came. He stepped back, not defeated, but corrected, because Harlem had rules. They weren't written anywhere. No charters, no councils. But everyone knew them the way sailors knew currents. Respect funerals. Don't escalate grief into war. And above all, measure yourself before you measure Bumpy Johnson. The hearse engine started. As it pulled away, Bumpy watched it like a man watching evidence leave a crime scene. Not mournful. Focused. A woman approached him next, middle-aged, eyes sharp through the veil of mourning. "You came for a reason," she said, not asking. Bumpy gave the faintest nod. "You gonna tell the family?" she asked. "Not today." She chose not to. "Then you be careful," she said quietly, "because whoever put those flowers on that casket, they hiding something." "No." She walked away without another word. Across the street. Didn't hurry. Power never hurried. When he reached the car, one of the young men opened the rear door. Bumpy paused before getting in, glancing once more at the block, the brownstones. It was Quiet Axe, a store owner lowering his gaze in respect. A passerby stepping aside half a second early. A lookout pretending to tie his shoe, just to signal the street was calm. Bumpy saw all of it, because his authority hadn't been built with fear alone. It had been built with balance. He paid debts. He kept order where chaos tried to root itself. He punished disrespect, but never without reason, and that was why his presence at the funeral mattered. If Bumpy attended your burial, It meant your life had intersected with Harlem's hidden structure, either through loyalty or betrayal. He lowered himself into the sedan slowly. He spoke, voice low enough that only the two men beside the car heard it. "Find out who paid for the flowers." They nodded immediately. "And the suit," he added. "Too expensive for the man they buried." "Yes, boss." Bumpy leaned back as the door shut. The sedan pulled into traffic, blending into Harlem's rhythm like it had never stopped. But inside the car, Bumpy's eyes stayed distant, because funerals told truths the living tried to hide, and this one had told him three things already. The dead man had money he shouldn't have had, respect he hadn't earned, and protection that arrived too late to save him. Bumpy tapped his cane lightly against the floor once, thinking, somebody buried more than a body today. He murmured. Neither of the young men spoke. They knew better than to interrupt when Bumpy's voice dropped into that tone, the tone that meant a quiet investigation had already begun. Outside, Harlem continued like normal. Vendors shouted. Radios played from open windows. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, Bumpy Johnson attended a stranger's funeral uninvited. And when Bumpy showed up uninvited, it meant the dead weren't the only ones about to be judged. The name on the funeral program was Elias Carter, printed clean. Respectable. Harmless. A name that didn't belong to the kind of flowers that had surrounded his casket. By the time sedan reached Lenox Avenue, Bumpy already knew that much. He hadn't spoken again after leaving the church. He didn't need to. The city spoke for him if you knew how to listen. Every storefront, every corner man, every bartender who kept his ear lower than his voice, they all held fragments, and fragments, when arranged right, told full stories. The sedan rolled to a stop outside a narrow barber shop squeezed between a tailor and a closed pawn window. The pole out front spun slow, red bleeding into white, white into blue. Bumpy stepped out without waiting for the door to be opened. Inside, a radio played jazz, soft enough not to interrupt conversation. When Bumpy entered, the buzz didn't stop, but it slowed. Not out of fear, out of adjustment. Men in Harlem didn't panic when Bumpy walked in. Panic meant guilt. Panic meant disrespect. Glasses low on his nose met Bumpy's reflection in the mirror. "Didn't know you cut hair now," the barber said. Lightly, Bumpy took the empty chair beside the wall but didn't sit. "I don't," he said. The barber nodded, as if that answer fit exactly where he expected it. "You hear about the funeral?" "Not a question. Yeah." The barber snipped carefully around his client's ear before speaking again. "Man buried today wasn't Elias Carter." The clippers went quiet. That sentence hung in the shop like smoke that refused to clear. Bumpy rested both hands on the head of his cane. "Who was he?" The barber wiped his scissors slowly. A murmur passed between the waiting men. Bumpy's face didn't move. "What did he do?" Bumpy asked. The barber's eyes flicked toward the shop window, then back. "He testified once." That word carried weight heavier than crime. Testified meant lines crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Against who? Bumpy asked. The barber hesitated, not out of fear of Briggs, but fear of the living men whose names followed that kind of history. "Federal boys were building something," he said quietly. "Smuggling routes, money movement, witnesses disappearing before trial. Briggs got caught in the middle. They squeezed him till he talked. Bumpy absorbed the information without reacting. And he stayed alive?" he asked. That's the part that never made sense. Because men who testified against power rarely died old. He went quiet after, the barber continued, name changed. To face him. That funeral didn't belong to the life he lived. Silence confirmed it. Bumpy had seen too many burials not to recognize staged respect. "You said 2 graves," Bumpy said. The barber nodded slowly. "Yeah, because the man buried today died once already." Bumpy's eyes sharpened slightly. Explain. The barber lowered his voice even further. Year he testified. Federal boys sealed the case, fast said it was retaliation. And it wasn't. Bumpy asked. The barber shook his head. That body was supposed to be Briggs. The weight of that revelation settled heavy in the room. So Briggs buried someone else under his death. One real, but only one funeral 30 years late. Bumpy tapped his cane once against the tile floor. Why come out now? He asked. The barber shrugged slightly. Men who hide that long either get tired or get found. Bumpy turned that over in his mind. If Briggs had testified against federal smuggling operations and survived by faking his death, then his continued existence was a liability, not just to criminals, to officials too, because witnesses who lived long enough sometimes remembered too much. Who paid for the funeral? Bumpy asked. The barber's mouth thinned. That's the strange part. Family didn't have the money. Didn't even know the cost till after arrangements were made. Who arranged it? No one knows. Funeral home got paid cash. Clean bills. No names. Professional, organized, careful enough to stage respect, but not public enough to claim it. Bumpy stepped toward the door, but paused before leaving. You ever see Briggs scared? He asked without turning. The barber thought about it. Only once. When? Couple months back, came in for a shave. Man kept looking at the mirror behind him more than his own reflection. Bumpy nodded once. A man hiding from the past, he said quietly. Don't fear memories. He stepped outside before the barber could answer. The winter sun had climbed higher, reflecting off car windows like scattered signals. Bumpy stood on the sidewalk, cane planted, thinking. If Briggs had been a federal witness, then three forces could want him buried: criminals he testified against, officials he embarrassed, or partners he betrayed. But the flowers, the expensive suit, the staged respect, that felt less like revenge and more like containment. As if someone wanted him buried properly, so no one would question the burial. Bumpy entered the sedan again. Well? One of the young men asked. That wasn't Elias Carter, Bumpy sighed. That was Leon Briggs. Both men exchanged a look. Thought he died years ago, one muttered. He did, Bumpy said calmly. Once. They didn't ask for clarification. They didn't need it. Check federal archives, Bumpy continued. Witness protection records. Doc investigations from 30 years back. That deep? The driver asked. Bumpy's gaze stayed forward. Truth don't stay buried without help. The car pulled into motion again. As Harlem rolled past the windows, Bumpy's thoughts settled into structure. Briggs had testified. Briggs had faked his death. Briggs had lived quietly for decades. And now, someone had given him a funeral too. Expensive for silence, which meant one thing. The burial wasn't for grief. It was for closure. But closure for who? Bumpy tapped his cane lightly again, eyes narrowing. Find out who visited him last, he said. Week before he died. Yes, boss. And check police records. Quiet deaths, missing files. Anything tied to his testimony. The young men nodded, already planning the routes, the questions, the bribes if needed, because they understood what Bumpy understood. This wasn't about the dead man anymore. This was about the truth he carried. A truth important enough to kill for once, and important enough to bury twice. The sedan turned down a narrower street, disappearing into Harlem's deeper arteries. Behind them, life continued, vendors shouting, radios playing, laughter rising from stoops. But beneath it all, something long buried had begun shifting, because Bumpy Johnson had attended a stranger's funeral uninvited, and discovered the man inside the coffin had already died once before, which meant whoever buried him the second time was making sure he would never speak again. The first message came wrapped in politeness. A sealed envelope, cream paper, handed to Bumpy's doorman by a boy too young to understand what he was delivering. The boy didn't linger. He didn't ask for a tip. He ran the moment the envelope left his fingers. Like the paper itself carried heat, Bumpy opened it at his desk with a letter opener that had no shine left. Inside was a single funeral program, the same one from the church Elias Carter printed. Clean at the top, as if ink could make a lie respectable. Across the back, in neat handwriting, one sentence: "Some graves are not yours to visit." No signature, no flourish, just the soft insult of instruction. Bumpy stared at it a long time without blinking. The room around him didn't move. The clock ticked, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to quicken. His lieutenant, Sonny, waited by the wall. Sonny had the kind of restlessness that made furniture nervous. He watched Bumpy's face for a crack. There wasn't one. "They telling you where you can't walk now?" Sonny asked, voice tight. Bumpy set the program down, flat, smoothing the paper with his palm as if it was a crease in his own coat. "They not telling," Bumpy said. "They testing." Sonny stepped forward. "We can answer that." Bumpy lifted his eyes, and Sonny stopped walking. That gaze didn't need to be sharp. It didn't need anger. It carried the weight of a man who had survived anger long enough to master it. "Answer it how?" Bumpy asked. Sonny hesitated, then said what men like Sonny always said when insulted: "With noise." Bumpy's fingers rested on the program. "No," he said quietly. "Noise is what they want." Sonny's jaw worked, frustration chewing at him. "They sent that to your house, Bumpy. I know. That's disrespect." "It is." Sonny leaned closer. "Then let us handle it." Bumpy remained seated, calm, unmoving. "Not yet," he said. Sonny exhaled through his nose hard, like a bull trying not to charge. Bumpy finally rose and walked to the window. Outside, Harlem carried on men selling newspapers, women dragging groceries, kids skipping between hydrants. A normal day, but Bumpy knew normal days were often the most dangerous, because danger hid better when nobody expected it. "You ever seen a man slap another man in a crowded room?" Bumpy said, still looking out, and then stepped back smiling. Sonny nodded slowly. "Because he wants the room to watch what happens next," Bumpy continued. "He wants the other man to swing so he can say it was self-defense." Sonny understood, but he didn't like it. "So you saying this message is bait?" Bumpy nodded once. "Funeral was bait too," he said. "Church full of witnesses, holy walls, respectable eyes." Sonny's gaze sharpened. "They tried to corner you." Bumpy turned from the window. "And I sat down," he said. Like a gentleman." That statement carried its own kind of violence, because it meant Bumpy had refused the fight the enemy had written for him. Second message came that evening. This one wasn't paper. It was a man, a well-dressed man who arrived at Bumpy's usual restaurant just after dusk. When the lamps made the windows glow warm and safe, the man didn't look like a gangster. Tie, hands clean, eyes careful. He asked for Bumpy by name. The waiter's face tightened. Word traveled. Bumpy didn't rise from his table. He didn't have to. The man was brought over, escorted politely by two of Bumpy's men. He stopped at the edge of the table. Respectful distance, respectful posture, but not respectful eyes. "I'm here on behalf of some people," the man said softly. Bumpy continued cutting his food. "I know," Bumpy replied. The man blinked at the lack of curiosity. "They want to offer you advice." Bumpy chewed once, swallowed. "I don't need advice." The man forced a small smile. "It's about the funeral." Bumpy set his fork down. Now the room felt colder. The man continued quickly, sensing he'd reached the line. "The situation is delicate," he said. "Old matters, old names." It's best for everyone if it stays buried. Bumpy leaned back. Slightly, not aggressive. It can be, he said. If you choose it. Bumpy's eyes held him in place. You know something, Bumpy said, voice quiet, about the difference between a request and an order? The man's lips parted, but no words came. Bumpy continued, calm as prayer. A request comes with respect, he said. An order comes with a consequence. The man's throat tightened. No one wants consequences, he said. Bumpy gave a faint nod. That's why you hear. The man shifted, trying to maintain dignity. They're not your enemies, he sighed. Bumpy's face didn't change. They sent a boy to my door, Bumpy replied. Then they sent you to my table. That's enemy behavior. The man stiffened. They're concerned about unrest. Bumpy's gaze drifted past him, toward the restaurant window where Harlem moved like a living river. Harlem don't unrest, Bumpy said. Harlem gets pushed. The man's mouth tightened. And when Harlem gets pushed, Bumpy continued, it remembers who pushed. The man realized he wasn't winning anything here. He lowered his voice. You don't want this, he said. Because if you dig into that funeral, it won't just be criminals who notice. Bumpy looked back at him. That sentence told the truth by accident, not just criminals. Bumpy nodded slowly, as if the man had finally said something useful. So, there it is, Bumpy said. The man frowned. What? The reason you here, Bumpy said quietly. You ain't protecting the dead, you protecting the living. The man tried to hold Bumpy's gaze and failed. His eyes flickered down to the table. Bumpy leaned in just slightly. Tell them, he said, I went to that funeral because I wanted to. The man swallowed again. And tell them something else. Bumpy continued, voice steady. The man waited, tense. Bumpy's words landed like a closed door. I don't get asked where to walk. Silence pressed tight between them. Then Bumpy nodded once. A dismissal that didn't need volume. The man turned to go, but Bumpy's voice stopped him. One more thing. The man froze. Bumpy spoke without changing his tone. Next time you bring a message to my table, he said, bring it with respect. Or don't bring it at all. The man left, steps measured, face pale beneath restaurant light. Sonny watched him go, fists clenched. That man ain't just a messenger, Sonny said. He's tied to something bigger. Bumpy lifted his glass of water and took a slow sip. I know, he said. Sonny leaned closer. So what now? Bumpy set the glass down gently. Now, he said, we find out who's brave enough to threaten me, and still call it advice. Outside, Harlem's streetlights clicked on one by one, and somewhere behind those lights, someone believed they had drawn a boundary around Bumpy Johnson. They believed the church was the warning, the note was the fence, the messenger was the lock. Bumpy's calm proved something they hadn't calculated. A man who's ruled through restraint doesn't get trapped by insults. He uses them, because every act of disrespect, delivered in broad daylight, tells you who thinks you've grown weak. And Bumpy Johnson had just been told quietly, politely, directly that there were graves he didn't own. He stared at the funeral program again later that night. Then he folded it once, carefully, and placed it in his desk drawer. Not as a threat. As evidence, because Bumpy didn't answer bait with noise. He answered it with memory. Bumpy didn't move fast. Fast was for men who needed luck. He moved with weight, one quiet step at a time, until the people around him began to realize there was nowhere left to stand that wasn't inside his shadow. The next morning, Harlem woke to the same routines. Storefront gates rattled open. Coffee steamed from paper cups. Men swept their stoops like they could sweep trouble away with dust, but in the back rooms and side halls, Bumpy's questions had already started walking, not shouted. not announced, asked in a tone that made honesty feel safer than lies. So, mortician on 125th hand, still smelling faintly of chemicals, admitted the payment came in a plain envelope. No receipt requested, no name written. The bills were clean, folded the way careful men fold money. A church deaconized like tired glass said a stranger donated for the family. The stranger didn't pray. He didn't stay. He just watched the pews like he was counting. A tailor on 7th Avenue remembered fitting the expensive black
suit, not for Elias Carter, not even for Leon Briggs.
For a man who came in 2 days before the funeral and said it was for someone who needs to look right in the end. What did he look like? Bumpy asked. The tailor hesitated, then gave the description slowly, as if the words themselves might get him hurt. White, he said. Older. Hands soft. Shoes too clean for Harlem. Soft hands. Clean shoes, not street, not labor, and still bold enough to stand close to death. Bumpy sat in a back room above a restaurant, the kind of room where men spoke carefully and the walls didn't repeat what they heard. Sonny stood nearby, restless as ever. A notebook lay open on the table, names and details written in tight script. So what we got? Sonny asked. Bumpy didn't answer right away. He watched the smoke from his cigarette rise and thin out slow, patient, inevitable. Finally, he spoke. We got a man, he said, who paid to bury another man twice. Sonny frowned. Why pay to bury him? To own the silence, Bumpy replied. He tapped ash into a tray. When a man dies plain, Bumpy continued, questions stay alive. When a man dies with flowers, with ceremony, with respect, people accept it easier. Sonny leaned forward. So this is someone who wanted the neighborhood to stop looking. Bumpy nodded. And someone who knew I'd look anyway. Sonny's eyes tightened. That note. Bumpy reached into his coat and placed the folded funeral program on the table. Some graves are not yours to visit. Sonny read aloud, jaw hardening. Bumpy's voice stayed calm. That's not a warning, he said. That's a confession. Sonny looked up. How? Bumpy's gaze didn't waver. Because a man only tells you what you can't touch, he said. When he's hiding something under it. He leaned back. What did Briggs know? Sonny asked. And who is this soft-handed man? Bumpy stared at the notebook. Briggs testified, he said. Long time ago, dock investigations, money moving, names that never saw daylight. Sonny nodded. So criminals, maybe, Bumpy cut in gently. But criminals don't send clean shoes to buy suits. Sonny stopped, considering. You think official. Bumpy didn't say yes. He didn't have to dot in Harlem. Official didn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wore a pen. Sometimes it wore a robe. Sometimes it wore a calm smile and a hand that never touched labor. Bumpy stood. Where are we going? Sonny asked. Bumpy picked up his cane. Back to the place they tried to trap me? He said. Sonny blinked. The church? Bumpy nodded once. When? A man sets bait, he said. He comes back to see if it worked. The church sat quiet that afternoon. No funeral line. No organ. Just dust and sunlight through stained glass, painting the pews in tired colors. Bumpy entered without announcement. This time, his men stayed outside. Not because he didn't need them, but because he didn't need the room to think he needed them. Inside, the preacher stood near the altar, cleaning up hymn books. He froze when he saw Bumpy, then forced himself to breathe. Mr. Johnson, he said carefully. Bumpy removed his hat. Preacher, he replied. The preacher swallowed. What can I do for you? Bumpy walked down the aisle at the same pace. He had walked it at the funeral, slow enough to let every step speak. I want to know, Bumpy said softly, who sat in the back. The preacher's eyes flickered. I don't understand. You do, Bumpy said. The preacher hesitated, wrestling with his conscience and his fear. Bumpy didn't threaten him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited, as if time belonged to him. Finally, the preacher spoke. Man came before. The service, he said, left money. Told me it was for the family. What did he look like? The preacher described the same thing. White, older, hands soft, shoes too clean. Bumpy nodded slightly. And where did he sit? Bumpy asked. The preacher pointed to the last pew. Bumpy walked there, running his fingers lightly along the wood. Then he noticed something small a scratch in the varnish, fresh. A mark from a ring, maybe. A hand gripping too hard. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. Preacher, he said, still calm. You see his face? The preacher hesitated. I saw enough. Bumpy turned. Did he look scared? He asked. The preacher blinked, surprised by the question. No, he said slowly. He looked satisfied. Satisfied. That word told Bumpy everything. The man didn't come to mourn. He came to confirm the burial. He came to see if anyone important noticed. Bumpy walked back down the aisle and stopped before the altar. He didn't pray, but he did speak. Like a man who understood sacred law as well as street law. Preacher, he said, a church is a place where truth gets spoken. The preacher swallowed. Yes. Bumpy's eyes held him steady. Then don't help liars use your walls, he said. The preacher nodded, shaken. Bumpy put his hat back on and turned to leave. At the doors. He paused. One more thing, he said. The preacher looked up quickly. If that man comes again, Bumpy said, you tell him you saw me. The preacher stared. Tell him. Bumpy opened the door gently. Tell him, Bumpy said. Harlem don't bury truth just because somebody paid for flowers. He stepped. Outside, the street was bright. Kids played near a hydrant. A woman argued with a grocer. The world looked ordinary, but Bumpy felt the tension shift, because now the trap had been turned around. Now the bait wasn't the funeral. It was Bumpy's presence. He climbed into the sedan and spoke to Sonny without looking at him. Bring me a list, he said, of every white man with soft hands who's been seen around those docks. Lawyers, judges, inspectors, anyone who don't belong but still moves like they own the place. Sonny nodded. And find out, Bumpy added, voice low, who had Briggs's old testimony sealed. Sonny's eyes widened slightly. That's deep, he said. Bumpy's expression didn't change. Deep is where they hide what matters. He replied. The sedan rolled forward. Harlem passed by, steady and alive. But in Bumpy's mind, the pieces were aligning. A witness who lived too long. A funeral staged too clean. A polite insult delivered like an order. And a soft-handed man satisfied at the back of a church. Bumpy didn't need to announce what would happen next. Power didn't announce. Power arrived quietly, in the space between words, and made the world adjust. That night, Bumpy sat again at his desk, drawer open. Funeral program in his hand. He didn't crumple it. He didn't burn it. He kept it. Because it was proof that someone had tried to tell him where he could walk. And Bumpy Johnson's domination wasn't loud. It was the certainty that no man criminal or official could draw a boundary around him without first paying the price. The list arrived 3 nights later, not handed over in a rush, not delivered with ceremony. Sonny placed it on Bumpy's desk the way a man places something heavy on sacred ground, careful, deliberate, aware of the weight it carried beyond paper. Bumpy read it without speaking. Names. Inspectors tied to dock seizures, customs auditors who signed off on missing cargo, 2 attorneys who specialized in sealed federal testimonies, and 1 retired appellate judge who had quietly advised shipping unions after leaving the bench. Soft hands, Clean shoes. Men who never lifted crates, yet controlled what passed through them. Bumpy's finger stopped on the judge's name. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Power recognized power, even when it tried to hide behind retirement and respectability. Testimony records? Bumpy asked. Sonny slid another folder forward. Sealed 30 years ago, he said. But one clerk remembered processing copies before they disappeared. Bumpy opened the folder. Inside was a thin summary, half redacted, half forgotten, but enough remained to speak. Leon Briggs hadn't just testified about smugglers. He testified about protection, not street protection, institutional protection. Cargo moving through ports untouched. Inspections waived. Evidence misplaced before indictments. And buried deep in the testimony was a reference to judicial interference. Bumpy closed the folder slowly. The room stayed silent long enough for the truth to settle. They didn't kill him back then, Sonny said quietly. They used him. Bumpy nodded faintly. A witness alive is leverage, he said. A witness dead is liability. Sonny's eyes hardened. So why bury him now? Bumpy leaned back in his chair. Because somebody from that testimony, he said, still breathing. And if Briggs had resurfaced, even quietly, it meant he had spoken again. Or threatened to. Funerals, Bumpy knew, weren't always. For mourning. Sometimes there were cleanup. Weeks passed. No public retaliation. Came. No loud arrests. No bodies dropped in alleys to send messages. Instead, Harlem noticed quieter shifts. An inspector reassigned suddenly. A shipping contract dissolved overnight. A law office closed for renovations that never finished. And the retired judge respected, insulated, announced an abrupt departure from advisory work, citing health. Men like that didn't fall. Publicly, they withdrew quietly when pressure reached their bones. One evening, Bumpy stood outside the same church again. Not for a funeral this time, just passing. The stained glass windows glowed warm in the dusk, colors bending across the sidewalk. Like softened memories, Sonny stood beside him. So that's it? Sonny asked. No final move? Bumpy rested both hands on his cane. You think closure always loud? He asked. Sonny shrugged slightly. Bumpy's gaze stayed on the church doors. Man like Briggs, he said, lived 2 lives, died twice. First time in fear, second time in silence. He paused. Now the men who used him, they lived different too. Sonny understood. Not imprisoned, not exposed, but aware that Harlem had noticed. Aware that Bumpy had traced the burial back to them. Aware that silence had been forced, not chosen. That's domination? Sonny asked. Bumpy nodded once. Real domination, he said, is when a man corrects his behavior without you touching him. They stood there another moment. The block moved around them, cars passing, footsteps echoing, life continuing like nothing historic had unfolded beneath it, because that was Bumpy's legacy. He didn't need headlines. He didn't need spectacle. His power lived in balance, protecting community, correcting threats, keeping forces bigger than Harlem from believing they could operate inside it unchecked. Before leaving, Bumpy looked once more at the church. A funeral ain't just about the dead, he said quietly. It's about what gets buried with them. Sonny nodded. And what didn't get buried? He asked. Bumpy's eyes sharpened slightly beneath the brim of his hat. Truth, he said. He turned and walked down the sidewalk, cane tapping a steady rhythm against concrete. Behind him, the church doors closed for the night, but the story didn't stay buried. For 30 years, Leon Briggs's truth had been hidden beneath sealed files and staged respect, until one day, Bumpy Johnson attended a stranger's funeral uninvited, and reminded everyone watching that no matter how deep you bury it, truth answers to power. And power, when disciplined, never needs to shout.